The other group I looked at are men's rights activists, who are, if you like, the more respectable face of the manosphere. They have a veneer of respectability, which is granted by the fact that they talk about and pay lip service to very real issues affecting men. They talk about issues like the male mental health crisis, about support for war veterans, about workplace-related injury, and they then do absolutely nothing to tackle those issues.
This video is part of a series where I will be fact-checking a number of claims that Laura Bates has made about the men's human rights movement in her book, Men Who Hate Women. To do this most effectively, I have taken the time to talk to some of the people that Laura Bates only chose to talk about, and in the case of some of the more ready-baked urban myths that she attempts to reheat in her book, I'll be delving into the Glass Blind Spot's archives to uncover some of the devil in the detail that Miss Bates has perhaps consciously or unconsciously chosen to leave out. And in this video, I will be considering her claim that men's rights activists don't do anything to help men because they're far too busy slagging off women.
Huge amounts of time abusing women, attacking feminists, attempting to bring lawsuits to defund female sexual violence shelters. They're actually having a massive impact because they've caught the ear of policymakers around the world.
In a moment, I'm going to play a segment from my series Problems with Men, which addresses this claim directly. But first, I invite you to consider the perspective of the founder of Voice for Men, Paul Elam, from a segment of my interview with him at the 2019 International Conference on Men's Issues.
One of the main attack points about men's rights activism is that A, it doesn't do anything practical to help men, okay, and B, that it attacks feminism, okay. Now,
they say that like it's a bad thing?
Yeah. Oh no, it's just those are the two common criticisms.
Oh, okay.
You'll be familiar with that, I presume. Basically, if to belittle men's rights activism, people say, well, all it does is attack feminism. And as you say, as if that's something that's a bad thing. It's more a case of kind of that. I would say it's impossible for men's rights activism not to talk about feminism because it's the monopoly show. It's the major infrastructure that impacts. So I think it's a non-argument.
There is, and this is not a defensive reaction. There
Sure.
is a huge amount of ignorance in those kind of statements, and let me explain why. One. Yes, I mean, you can't talk about gender issues without bringing feminism into the discussion. It's impossible. And yes, we're critical of feminism. There's plenty of very good reasons to be critical of that. But it's been long stressed, for instance, on AVFM, which is the flagship of the men's movement, online anyway, that we're not just dealing with feminism. That, yes, criticize feminism, but the picture's bigger than that. There's more problems. I've said it a couple of times on the mic today. We're looking at much more than just feminism. As far as it hasn't done anything practical for men, my email inbox proves that's untrue.
Yeah.
With the literally dozens and dozens of men I've heard from who were saying, I was thinking about taking myself out until I found your work or Karen Strawn's work, and now I feel sane and I'm rebuilding my life toward wholeness. And when you come to one of these conferences, you see that in action going on all around you. If that's not a practical benefit, I don't know what is. So, I mean, I take it as a compliment. If somebody thinks that we're not doing any good for men, then they must not care about men very much.
Yeah, okay.
Men don't tend to get ready to become a part of this movement until they've been hurt by not being a part of it.
Yes.
And then they say, suddenly they find religion. Oh, yeah, well, maybe Paul Elam isn't full of shit. Maybe he's saying something true now that they've taken my kids away.
Yeah.
And now that they've taken my home and my money and put me in jail.
Okay.
And so we grow slowly. Feminism is doing progressively more damage as time goes by, which is directly feeding the slow growth of this movement.
Yeah.
And some guys will never get. Some guys will have their children taken away, their home taken away, and as soon as they have enough money, they'll find another wife.
Okay, yeah.
So our growth will be slow, but it is 100% worthwhile for the men in it who are getting the benefit.
Yeah.
Because that is saving lives.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And that. So I mean, essentially, if somebody is engaged with men's rights, they may find some personal development or somebody to listen. I think is something that strikes me as.
What I get mostly from people is that somebody who articulated what they've had in their mind and couldn't find words to express.
Yeah.
And that they finally hear somebody saying what's been going on and all the turmoil and everything. And that for many men is just a sudden rush of release, relief and validation that they've desperately needed.
Unlike feminism or feminist, you will currently struggle to find the definition for men's rights activism or activist in most popular dictionaries. Nevertheless, many people tend to understand men's rights activism to be, at least to some extent, a mirror image of feminism. So let's begin with that. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines feminism in two ways as follows. It is both the theory of the political, economic, and social equality of the sexes, and organised activity on behalf of women's rights and interests. The second of these meanings most immediately aligns with the concept of men's rights activism, so let's consider this first, because just as a feminist or women's rights activist is generally understood to participate in activism or advocacy on behalf of women's interests, a men's rights activist is understood to participate in activism or advocacy on behalf of the rights and interests of men. It logically follows that people advocating for equality and human rights for men or women could be perceived as working towards two sides of a common or shared goal. And while to some extent this can be true, more often than not, especially in mainstream narratives, men's rights activists, or MRAs, and women's rights activists, or feminists, are viewed as two very separate movements, sometimes operating in opposition to each other, who advocate on behalf of and seek legal protections and civil and economic gains exclusively for one sex only, sometimes even at the expense of the other.
Men like to talk a good game, but they don't realise that equality isn't just about pushing someone forward, it's also about pushing some people back.
Like when we create a space, our own space, to talk about our own issues and the things that we have to deal with, whether it be harassment or objectification or income inequality, whatever the case may be, these MRAs decide to go trample on our parade and say, but what about the men's? I'm sorry, you have been taking over our politics and our media for God knows when, so don't even start with that whole, but you don't think about the men's issue. Well, then you know what? Start your own goddamn movement, which they have.
I'm reading fucking Facebook. It's not just for you, Mr. Entitled.
Significantly, many of the criticisms directed and stereotypes projected onto MRAs are essentially a mirror image, or at least very similar to those often associated with feminists. Where feminists are accused of hating men, MRAs are accused of misogyny. Both have been portrayed unfavourably as unhappy, unattractive, angry, narcissistic, friendless, or unsuccessful in life or love. Common stereotypical tropes about feminists include fat, hairy, and lesbian, while MRAs are often presumed to have a tiny penis and live in their mother's basements. MRAs are portrayed as weak and lacking classical masculine traits, just as feminists are sometimes perceived to be unfeminine. MRAs have been accused of perpetuating myths or exaggerating the prevalence of such things as false rape allegations or paternity fraud, while feminists are frequently accused of cherry-picking statistics or promoting victimology, and dubious social science theories like toxic masculinity. Some say feminism wants to destroy the family unit, others say MRAs want to drag us back to the 1950s. Online, MRAs are accused of abusive behaviour and coordinated harassment, while feminists are criticised for creating Twitter mobs and conflating criticism with abuse. And significantly, both have at times been accused of supremacist behaviour, pushing authoritarian or extremist positions, and actually actively advocating against equal opportunities and equal rights for all. As with most stereotypes, there will of course be some truth to be found amongst so many such negative portrayals, especially at an individual level. Perhaps most obviously, many activists will have been inspired to take action following a personal experience of sex discrimination or an abusive relationship, or negative outcomes in a family or criminal court. But then again, many simply become involved because instinctually they feel that it's the right thing to do. And of course, activism can be monetized, and so for some, first and foremost, it can mean a full-time career. One example of this would be feminist campaigner, writer and broadcaster Caroline Criado Perez, who's one of the most high-profile feminists currently working in the United Kingdom, and regularly appears as an expert witness in legacy news media discussions about gender equality.
Do you think it is possible even, that the writer is correct to say the reason there are fewer women programmers is because they aren't as much into programming?
There is absolutely no evidence to suggest that this is a result of biological differences. The idea that, having a uterus makes me less predisposed to programming, as opposed to the way in which we bring up boys and girls, for which there is a lot of evidence.
Famous feminists like Caroline Criado Perez also offer a useful benchmark to consider when addressing one of the most common criticisms or pejorative perspectives pushed onto men's rights activists.
Both men and women suffer domestic violence. But has the men's rights movement set up shelters for men? No, instead they spend their time trolling women.
To some extent, this might be considered to be a fairly factual statement, but it's also very far from being fair, especially when you consider the purpose and definition of men's rights activism, and compare it to the activism that many advocates of women's rights prioritise themselves. For example, Caroline Criado Perez is most famous for convincing the Bank of England to put a female historical figure on their banknotes, and securing the first statue of a woman in Parliament Square. And yet, she is not a banker or a builder, and she does not sculpt statues. Instead, her activity, her activism on behalf of women's rights and interests, includes savvy social media campaigning and lobbying others who have the power to create the type of change or interventions that she wants to see, but could never hope to achieve on her own. And anyone familiar with the history and indeed present-day function and funding model of the domestic violence charity Refuge will know that it is not necessarily accurate to claim that feminists build shelters either, and they certainly don't exclusively pay for the exclusive services that they provide, because local authorities are responsible for commissioning emergency refuge accommodation and have a statutory duty to provide accommodation for victims of domestic abuse facing homelessness. Central government also provides some core funding and recently committed £100 million between 2018 and 2020 to specifically combat violence against women and girls. Feminist lobby groups wield incredible influence in this area, and on the direction and focus of a wide range of state-funded public provision policy positions. And as they focused almost exclusively on women's rights and interests, it logically follows that the relative absence of gender equality lobbyists speaking for boys and men can be seen to be one of the more obvious reasons why, out of the approximate 800 beds available in emergency refuge accommodation in the Greater London area, none are currently available to men. In such context, logically and strategically, it makes sense that activism aimed at lobbying local and central government might, in the long term, be more effective than attempting to build an entirely different and parallel, privately funded public service infrastructure entirely from the ground up, especially in the context that it has been illegal for public and private service providers to directly discriminate against men or women since the 1970s, and the public authorities who spend public money providing services to the public have additional legal duties to show that they are advancing equality and eliminating discrimination in everything they do.
It happens to men too, you know.
It happens to men.
Do you want a point? It happens to men as well. Oh, yeah, okay.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.